And if you want to drive a car, you don't use the rear view mirror, you look out the front mirror. But if you're insistent on turning around and looking out the rear mirror while you're driving a car and it's a twisty, bendy road, you might drive off a cliff. And the history of the Fed is that they have overshot in both directions.
Join us for an eye-opening discussion with Dave Weisberger, CEO of CoinRoutes, as he dissects the intricacies of the Federal Reserve's strategies and their impact on the economy. In this exclusive video, Dave shares his expertise on managing inflationary expectations, yield curves, and budget constraints. Uncover the role of commodity prices, PPI, and direct family subsidies in shaping inflation trends. Delve into the Fed's efforts to balance consumer demand, asset prices, and interest rates while avoiding disruptive economic consequences. Get ready for an in-depth analysis that reveals the Fed's tactics for economic stability and growth.
If the goal is to cut the market to bring down the wealth effect, because he hasn't so far knocked down the market. And there are people who quite cynically believe that is what he's trying to do. I personally believe what he's trying to do is what he has said he's been trying to do. And he's actually done an incredible job of it. He's trying to manage inflationary expectations, that there's less wage push inflation. He's trying to manage a yield curve that stays inverted because he wants the government to be able to borrow without it busting the budget. Keep in mind, if we had long rates at a normal 2% upslope from here, that would be more or less a doubling of our debt service payments, which would effectively squeeze out all discretionary payments. And it would mean the federal government literally couldn't spend a dime without going into deficit. That is a serious problem. And that is one that he, I think, is quite focused on, has been focused on since the beginning. And I actually give him credit for engineering the negative yield curve without it directly impacting employment or being a recession, whereas a lot of people think that it's just kind of random. I don't believe in coincidence or random, David. It just never have. I think there are many cross currents here, though. And look, when you look at the economy, there are many variables. This is not a function that you could draw on a single chart, right? So think about what caused the great inflation. And we could debate what the percentages were, and lots of people can debate it, but there were a few cross currents that caused the massive bump in inflation. There are three that people talk about. I think all were relevant. Number one, you pumped an enormous amount of money into the economy. I mean, half of all dollars created, all within a very short period of time to, quote, combat the pandemic. I learned, at the Milton Friedman School, basically, although I went to Northwestern, I always believed in the Chicago School of Economics better, and you and I have talked about that before. The fact is, if you double the amount of dollars, don't expect the price of goods in dollars to do anything but go up. The second thing that happened simultaneously were constrained supply. We had the pandemic, cut supply lines all around the world, lots and lots of pressure on supplies, commodities, many things became more dear, more expensive to ship, more expensive to produce. Lots of things didn't get produced. So the supply side was there, the demand stayed where it was, inflation goes higher. Very basic economics 101. The third thing that happened, they gave helicopter money to people. They did something that reversed a policy of 30 years. For 30 years, we had a policy where most inflation showed up in asset prices. It was targeted to show up in asset prices. And so assets are held mostly by the rich, and those assets actually contribute to some consumer disinflation. I'll get to that in a heartbeat, but it went to asset prices. Here, they gave $5,000, $6,000 to families who could spend. And I think I talked about it the last time I was on, my trip from New York when I was emigrating to Florida, and all the amounts at all the hotels along the way were full with people spending their stimulus checks, trying to get the heck out. South Beach was overrun by people who were spending money that they were just kind of given. It's not like they were using it for what the intention was. They used it for discretionary spending. Well, you put that much money in the hands of discretionary spending in a supply-constrained environment, what do you expect is going to happen? Bam. Inflation goes crazy. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this, about the switch from targeting asset prices to targeting, to direct family subsidies, is asset prices. When the cost of money is artificially cheap, one of the things that allows companies to do is to automate more, offshore more, because those fixed costs cost you less as you can borrow that money. And so you ended up with all this disinflationary pressure from outsourcing and from automating, which actually decreased consumer inflation. People could buy cheaper goods that were produced, overseas or produced by robots and or served by robots. So you all those things going simultaneously. So now you're at the Federal Reserve. What do you not want to do? Well, you want to cut the consumer demand push inflation. You want to decrease inflationary expectations and therefore constrain the economy and bring, kind of normalize conditions. You want to normalize conditions, but you really don't want to do things to make it harder to invest in technologies that will improve the supply chain and actually be disinflationary. And people like the stalwart, on the Odd Lots podcast talk about this all the time, but it's a very good point, and people don't generally look at it. I do think Powell understands all this stuff. And if you want to drive a car, you don't use the rear view mirror, you look out the front mirror. But if you're insistent on turning around and looking out the rear mirror while you're driving a car and it's a twisty, bendy road, you might drive off a cliff. And there are a lot of people out there who fear that analogy is what's going on at the Fed. Now, I don't think they're that dumb. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is by biasing the data that you care about to things that are clearly lagging indicators, you are likely to overshoot. And the history of the Fed, dating back as long as I've been in the business, and I hate to admit how long that is, so we'll leave that one lie, is that they have overshot in both directions. They certainly overshot on the downside when they were being accommodated for too long. We all understand that. At past recessions, they've overshot to the upside. And it's because of the generic method of looking at those what I'm going to call lagging indicators. And the reason that happens is because of the political pressure those lagging indicators create. That's my read on it anyway. I don't know where energy prices would be if the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was as full as it was at the beginning of the pandemic. And I don't think anybody does. But I think we have a pretty clear understanding that by us being willing to tap at least 50% of the SPR, that helped bring down oil prices. So we know that that's true. And that is a form of manipulation that people don't like to talk about. The second thing that is absolutely true is it's not the pandemic that was the issue. It was the response to the pandemic. So the government's shutting businesses down, causing supply things to go on and giving stimulus checks. That causes a shift up in the demand curves. And yes, over time that could work itself out, but it takes a lot of time. And you need to look at the way monetary policy was at that time in that policy response. Part of the policy response was to make interest rates negative, real interest rates, the highest they've ever been, meaning the lowest interest rates, but having the negative number being the largest in terms of real interest rates. And then when you look at whether or not he's actually been restrictive, I mean, the reality is that today's inflation rates, Fed policy, Fed funds are well within historical norms, probably toward the more accommodative side of historical norms. It's only norms compared to the last 5 years that it looks restrictive. So it's all relative, and you need to understand that. And Powell certainly understands that. The fact of the matter is, when Volcker, and I was, had just graduated college or was just in college when Volcker was doing that, and I was studying economics. The fact of the matter is Volcker raised interest rates to double-digit percent. He raised it to 6% over the peak rate of inflation. We are not even close to over the peak rate of inflation on interest rates. And in point of fact, that's why it's been a slow measured increase. And his hope is that the rate of inflation, which is now below the Fed's funds rate by a couple percent, is more or less where it should be in terms of historical norms. So under no way you could look at policy as massively restrictive. It went from the most accommodative Fed policy in history to normal. Now, that happens to be a very high rate of increase, but that is what it did. I think the market is assuming that the data is going to show the trend in the appropriate direction. So 4.6% of the Fed rate of 5.25 is still positive real interest rates. It's been a very long time since we've had positive real interest rates of any substantial notion. If 4% becomes the new norm from 4.6, that'll be 1% positive real interest rate. If it goes to like 3.5, now all of a sudden, you're getting back towards really kind of the middle of the range where the Fed likes to be in terms of where real interest rates are. So I think the market is basically saying, listen, They're going to watch to see what these numbers are, and if they trend in the right direction, they're going to keep a steady hand on the tiller. Because remember, they can't afford to have interest rates go too high for a couple of reasons. The things that are in the economy that could break are important. The most important of which is federal budget deficits. But it's also true, we've seen how much money or how much accommodation the Fed needs to do through their extraordinary program that we talked about last time, by virtue of bond prices dropping that are held on bank balance sheets. But there's a lot of commercial real estate. There's a lot of other things in the economy that they have to be concerned about. So they don't want to break things. They're only going to continue to push higher if they believe it's necessary to quell aggregate demand and stop wage push inflation. That's really what they're concerned about. So if you see a huge round across multiple industries of labor strikes and significant increases in wages and new contracts, yeah, I think they will increase rates. If not, I think they'll probably stay where they are. Now, of course, it has to be said, these prediction markets are notoriously fickle. They're very volatile. This was, 2 days ago or yesterday, this was a 96% that this was what was going to happen. But if you go back 6 months, the probabilities were dramatically different and vacillated a lot over that time. So yes, I think people in the market say, you know what, they're going to wait and see. And those numbers basically say the market is predicting the inflation numbers to continue to look better over time, if at least be in the right trend. And there's also a camp of people who believe we're going to have a significant market correction in the fall, which would mean to the Fed, potentially job done, don't need to do anymore. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but there are a lot of people who believe that.